The air had a bite to it that went beyond the usual crispness of a Yukon autumn. It was a sharp, needle-like cold that seemed to find its way through layers of wool and canvas, a cold that James Baker knew meant trouble. He stood on the porch of his small log cabin, a sturdy axe handle worn smooth in his calloused hand, and watched as the first fat flakes of snow began to drift down from a sky the colour of a steel blade. "It's early, Evelyn," he called back to his wife, his voice a low rumble. "Too early by half." Evelyn Baker emerged from the cabin, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Her face, etched with a quiet resilience that came from a decade of living in the wilderness, held a familiar look of concern. She didn't need a calendar to tell her that this was wrong. By all rights, they should have another 2, maybe 3 weeks of decent weather before the true freeze set in. "The wind's from the north," she said, pulling a shawl tight around her shoulders. "And I can feel it in my bones. It's not just a dusting." 10-year-old Tom came running out, his worn leather boots crunching on the thin layer of ice that had formed on the porch steps overnight. He was a small boy, but his eyes held the same seriousness as his parents'. "Papa, should I bring in the last of the kindling from the shed?" James nodded, a flicker of pride in his chest. His son understood the language of survival as well as any adult. "And stack it close to the stove, Tom. We might need it sooner than we think." The Baker family's cabin was their fortress against the wilderness. James had built it himself 5 years ago, meticulously fitting each log with a saddle notch so tight a knife blade couldn't slide between them. The roof was a thick layer of sod over a lattice of pine boughs and bark, an old Norwegian trapper's trick he'd learned in the Klondike. It kept the warmth in during the long winters and the cool in during the fleeting summers. Inside, it was a single, large room dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that was the heart of their home. But a good cabin was only half the battle. Survival in the Yukon was a constant, relentless calculation of resources. Every cord of wood, every strip of dried meat, every preserved jar of berries was a unit of life itself. And this sudden turn of weather was a variable they hadn't planned for. "I need to check the snares," James announced, heading for the axe. "The rabbits won't be out in this, but the squirrels might still be active. We can't afford to lose any more." Their food stores were decent, but not extravagant. The summer had been dry, and the berry harvest had been poor. James's hunt for a large moose had come up empty. They had enough dried salmon, salt pork, and preserved vegetables to last them through a normal winter. But this didn't feel like a normal winter. This felt like a threat. "Don't go too far," Evelyn warned, her voice unusually sharp. "The wind's picking up." James strapped his snowshoes to his boots, a crude but effective design he'd made from bent willow and leather thongs. The snow was already a few inches deep, soft and powdery, making a hushed sound as he walked. He had lived in the Yukon for 15 years and he knew its moods. This wasn't a mood, it was a cold, deliberate rage. He checked his squirrel snares first, a line of 20 simple wire loops he'd set up a half-mile from the cabin. It was a monotonous but critical chore. Most were empty, their empty loops a sign of the season's scarcity. But at the 18th snare he found a small, frozen squirrel, its fur matted with snow. He quickly unhooked it, a small victory, and tucked it into his canvas bag. As he turned back toward the cabin, the snow began to fall harder, faster. The gentle drifting flakes turned into a thick swirling curtain that obscured the trees and blotted out the sky. The wind howled, a deep, mournful sound that seemed to come from the heart of the mountains, a whiteout. It was the wilderness's most terrifying weapon, and it had been deployed without warning. James knew he was in trouble. He could no longer see the line of trees he had followed. The trail he had just made was being erased in seconds by the relentless snowfall. Panic, a cold and foreign sensation, tried to take hold, but he pushed it back. Panic was how you died in the Yukon. He had to think. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the lay of the land, the subtle slope of the ground, the direction of the wind. He had to trust his senses, his years of experience, the invisible map in his mind. He turned slightly and began to walk, his pace steady and slow, trusting his internal compass to guide him home. Back at the cabin, Evelyn stood at the single glass-paned window, her face pressed against the cold glass. The world outside had disappeared. The snow was a solid white wall, the wind a constant screaming presence. She held a lit oil lamp in her hand, its feeble light a tiny beacon against the storm's darkness. Tom sat on the floor, adding logs to the stove, his small body hunched against the cold that was already seeping in through the cabin's cracks. "He'll be all right, Mama," Tom said, his voice quiet but certain. "Papa knows the woods." Evelyn nodded, but her heart was a tight knot in her chest. She knew James's skills, but she also knew the absolute indifference of the Yukon winter. A person could be the best woodsman in the world, and still get lost, still freeze. She had to prepare for the worst. She began to pull out more logs from the indoor woodpile, stacking them near the stove. She checked the seal on the storage chest where the pemmican and dried salmon were kept. She wrapped a thick blanket around Tom and handed him a cup of hot water with a spoonful of molasses, a small comfort in a world suddenly filled with dread. The hours passed in a silent, agonizing vigil. The storm showed no signs of abating. The wind shrieked and howled and the snow piled against the cabin walls. Inside, the world was a small, warm bubble of light and heat, but a fragile one. The fire was their life, and it demanded to be fed. Just as Evelyn was about to give up all hope, she heard a sound over the wind's roar. A heavy thud, and then another. It was the sound of a snowshoe, followed by a grunt. She ran to the door, her hands fumbling with the heavy wooden bar that locked it. She pulled it open, and a blast of wind-driven snow filled the cabin. Standing there, a ghostly figure covered in a thick layer of white, was James. His face was a mask of frost, his eyelashes and eyebrows rimmed with ice. He staggered inside, shedding a cascade of snow as he leaned against the door to close it. "I almost didn't make it," he said, his voice raspy from the cold. "That was the fastest whiteout I've ever seen." Evelyn rushed to him, helping him out of his snowshoes and his coat, her hands brushing away the ice. Tom stood by the stove, holding a hot tin cup, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "You're home, James," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're home." As James warmed himself by the stove, he pulled the frozen squirrel from his bag. It was a meagre offering, but it was a testament to his resilience, a symbol of their small, hard-won victory against the encroaching cold. He looked at the window, now completely covered in snow, and then at his wife and son. The warmth of the cabin, the love in their eyes, felt like the greatest luxury in the world. He knew then, with a chilling certainty, that this winter was going to be different. It was going to be a test of everything they had, not just their skills and their supplies, but their very will to survive. The first battle had been won, but the war had just begun. The blizzard howled its furious symphony for 3 more days, a relentless onslaught that pressed against the sturdy log walls of the Baker cabin, as if trying to flatten it. Inside, the world was a small, flickering bastion of warmth and light, a stark contrast to the swirling white chaos outside. The small frozen squirrel James had brought back was already cleaned, skinned, and simmering in a stew with some dried root vegetables. Its gamey scent a welcome distraction from the metallic tang of fear that had permeated the air. James sat by the stove, meticulously cleaning his rifle, the familiar weight of the steel a comfort in his hands. His face, though still bearing traces of the frostbite that had nipped at his exposed cheeks, was calm. He was home. He was safe. But the near-death experience had sharpened his senses, honed his resolve. This wasn't just a tough winter. It was a challenge that demanded every ounce of their cunning and endurance. Evelyn moved with a quiet efficiency, mending Tom's worn wool socks by the light of a single oil lamp. Her movements were graceful, practiced, each stitch a testament to her unwavering determination to keep her family warm. The constant vigilance for drafts, the careful rationing of fuel, the endless task of mending. It was all part of her silent, formidable strength. Tom, meanwhile, was sketching on a slate by the firelight, drawing the intricate patterns of ice crystals that formed on the inside of their window coverings. He was a curious boy, finding beauty even in the bitter cold that threatened them. But every now and then his eyes would flick towards his father, then towards the window, a silent question in their depths. "How long do you think it'll last, Papa?" Tom finally asked, his voice barely a whisper against the stove's soft crackle. James glanced up from his rifle. "Hard to say, son. I've seen 'em last a week, sometimes more. But this one feels different. Heavier." He paused, running a thumb along the rifle's cold barrel. "The wind's been steady from the north, and that usually means a long, deep cold." Evelyn sighed, threading a new needle. "We'll be burning through our wood supply at this rate, and the flour's getting low." The realities of their predicament were stark. Their cabin, though well built, was not airtight. Small draughts, insidious and persistent, found their way through the chinking and around the window frames. Each one was a tiny thief, stealing precious heat, demanding more wood. The massive indoor woodpile, which James had meticulously stacked over the summer, now looked significantly smaller. It was their lifeline, and it was finite. "We'll need to rechink the north wall," James stated, looking towards the wall that bore the brunt of the blizzard. "And the window coverings need reinforcement. I saw ice forming on the inside of the glass earlier." The window was a double-paned affair, an expensive luxury in the wilderness, but even its 2 layers of glass couldn't completely defeat the Yukon's cold. Evelyn had already draped a heavy wool blanket over it, but the frost still snaked its way inward. "I'll get the moss and mud ready," Evelyn offered. "Tom, you can help me collect some of the animal hair from the traps. We can mix it in." Tom nodded, putting down his slate. He knew the routine. The chinking mixture was a precise science. Clay-rich mud from the riverbank, dried and stored, finely chopped moss for insulation, and animal hair, which acted like tiny reinforcing fibres, preventing cracks as the mixture dried and contracted in the cold. It was a centuries-old technique, passed down through generations of homesteaders, and it worked. As the blizzard raged outside, the family set to work on their fortress. James carefully scraped away the old crumbling chinking from the north wall, his fingers growing stiff despite his heavy mittens. Evelyn, meanwhile, mixed the new batch of mud and moss in a small bucket by the stove, adding handfuls of hair Tom brought from a small pouch. The hair, mostly beaver and rabbit fur collected from their traps, gave the mixture a peculiar, almost living texture. "Consistency is key," James instructed, his breath misting in the slightly cooler air near the wall. "Not too wet or it'll freeze before it sets. Not too dry, or it won't bind." He demonstrated with a practiced hand, pressing the sticky, fibrous mixture into the gaps between the logs, smoothing it with his bare fingers until it formed a seamless seal. Tom watched, then tried his own hand. His small fingers, though less experienced, were surprisingly adept. He felt the rough texture of the mud, the softness of the moss, the resilience of the hair. He understood that each ingredient played a vital role in their survival. This wasn't just mud. It was a shield against the deadly cold. By the time the sun, a pale anemic disk, finally showed itself through a break in the clouds 2 days later, the cabin was a tighter, warmer place. The north wall felt significantly less drafty, and the window, now completely covered by a resecured quilt, no longer showed signs of internal frost. The indoor woodpile, however, had dwindled further. The brief respite from the blizzard was a deception. The sky was a clear, brutal blue, but the air itself was still. That stillness, James knew, meant extreme cold, the kind of cold that stole your breath, made your nostril hairs freeze and turned metal brittle. He checked the outdoor thermometer he'd nailed to a sturdy pine tree near the cabin. It registered negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 45 degrees below zero. It was one of the coldest snaps he'd seen in years. "We need to get more wood, Evelyn," James stated, looking out at the frozen world. "We've got maybe 3 days left at this rate. Maybe 4 if we're careful." Not enough to ride out another storm. Evelyn's face paled. 3 days. It was a terrifyingly short lifeline. Their survival depended on a constant, relentless supply of fuel for the stove. Without it, their fortress would become a tomb. "Can you make it to the main lot?" she asked, referring to a stand of old-growth pines about 1.5 miles upriver, where James had felled most of their winter's supply. James squinted at the horizon. "With this cold, it'll be slow going, and the snow's deep, but we have no choice." He looked at Tom, who was listening intently. "Tom, you're coming with me?" Tom's eyes widened. He had helped his father with smaller wood-gathering trips, but never in conditions like this. He felt a thrill of fear, mixed with a deep sense of purpose. He was no longer just a boy. He was a vital part of their survival. The morning of the wood expedition dawned with an eerie, profound silence. The air was so cold it seemed to absorb all sound, muffling even the crunch of their snowshoes on the pristine snow. The sun was a distant, cold pearl in the impossibly blue sky, offering light but no warmth. James had spent the early hours preparing, sharpening his axe and saw until their blades glinted like mirrors, and carefully packing a canvas bag with pemmican, dried fruit, and a thermos of hot tea. Evelyn had bundled Tom in every layer of wool and fur they possessed, her hands trembling slightly as she tied his scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes visible. "Stay close to your father, Tom," she urged, her voice tight with unspoken fear. "Don't stray. Not for a moment." Tom nodded, his breath instantly freezing on the fur lining of his hood. He felt like a small, bundled bear. His small hands, encased in thick wool mittens, gripped the handle of a smaller axe James had made for him. It was a symbol of his responsibility, a weight he felt deeply. James slung his heavy crosscut saw over his shoulder, its long, gleaming blade reflecting the sparse sunlight. "We'll be back before dark, Evelyn," he promised, his voice gruff, but his eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze. "Keep the fire banked and watch the traps. We need every rabbit we can get." As they stepped out of the cabin, the cold seized Tom's lungs, burning with each breath. It was a physical shock, a brutal reminder of the wilderness's power. James set a slow, deliberate pace, breaking trail through the deep snow. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of their snowshoes and the distant, almost imperceptible groan of the frozen trees. "Why is it so quiet, Papa?" Tom whispered, his voice muffled by his scarf. "Too cold for anything to move much, son," James replied, his words puffing out in thick clouds of vapour. "Animals are hunkered down, just like we should be. But we got no choice." They walked for what felt like an eternity, the journey to the main woodlot a gruelling test of endurance. Tom's legs ached, his lungs burned, but he kept moving, following his father's steady tracks. He thought about the warmth of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the taste of Evelyn's stew. Those thoughts were fuel, pushing him forward. When they finally reached the woodlot, a dense stand of ancient pines, James surveyed the area with a critical eye. Most of the prime, dead-standing timber was gone, harvested in previous years. They would have to fell a living tree, a much harder, more dangerous task. "We'll take this one," James decided, pointing to a tall, straight pine, its branches heavy with snow. "It's been marked by a beetle infestation. Won't last another year anyway." Felling a live tree in such conditions was fraught with peril. The frozen wood was incredibly hard. The axe could easily glance off, and the risk of hypothermia from exertion and sweat was ever present. James began by clearing a wide area around the tree, shoveling away the deep snow to give them solid footing. "Watch where she falls, Tom," James instructed, his voice serious. "This is no game. Get clear when I tell you, and don't look back until she's down." He began to cut a notch on one side of the tree, the axe biting into the frozen wood with a resounding thwack. The sound, sharp and clear in the frigid air, echoed through the silent forest. It was slow, laborious work. The axe head, though sharp, rebounded off the dense wood. James worked with a methodical rhythm, his muscles straining, his breath coming in ragged gasps. After the notch was deep enough, he switched to the crosscut saw. "All right, son," he said, handing Tom one end of the saw. "Long, steady strokes. Let the saw do the work. Don't fight it." Tom gripped the wooden handle, his small hands dwarfed by it. Together they began the rhythmic push and pull, the saw's teeth grating against the frozen pine. Shish-shush, shish-shush. The sound was hypnotizing, a duet of man and nature. Sweat, cold and insidious, began to prickle Tom's skin beneath his many layers. He focused on his father's back, on the even movement of the saw, on the rising pile of sawdust, which looked like fine white snow. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, then began its long, slow descent towards the horizon. The cold was a constant gnawing presence, but the exertion kept their core temperatures up. They paused only briefly to eat some pemmican and drink the hot tea, the warmth of the liquid a fleeting luxury. "She's starting to lean," James announced, his voice strained. "Get back, Tom." "Now." Tom didn't hesitate. He scrambled backward through the snow away from the tree. James, after a final, powerful push on the saw, also retreated. For a moment the massive pine stood perfectly still, as if holding its breath. Then, with a groan that echoed through the entire forest, it began to sway. Slowly at first, then faster, faster, until it crashed down with a deafening roar, sending a shower of snow and splintered branches into the air. The impact shook the ground. "Clean fall," James said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Good work, son." Tom felt a surge of pride mixed with sheer exhaustion. He had helped fell a giant, but the work was far from over. Now came the bucking, cutting the massive trunk into manageable stove-length pieces, and then the splitting. James taught Tom how to buck with the crosscut saw, again emphasizing the rhythm and the precision. "Too long, it won't fit the stove. Too short, it burns too fast. 18 inches, son. That's the magic number." Then came the splitting. James used a heavy axe and iron wedges, demonstrating how to read the grain of the wood, how to find the natural checks, how to place the wedge for maximum effect with minimum effort. "Wood wants to split a certain way, Tom. You've got to listen to it, not fight it." Tom, wielding his small axe, tried to emulate his father. The frozen pine was stubborn, resisting his blows. His hands, despite the mittens, began to ache with the cold and the impact. He focused, concentrating on the grain, on the feel of the axe. After several attempts, he managed a small, satisfying crack. "There you go," James encouraged, his face lit with a rare smile. "You got it, boy." They worked until the light began to fade, their bodies aching, their muscles screaming. They had processed a good portion of the tree, enough for 2 sled loads, but they could only take 1 today. They loaded the heavy split logs onto their sturdy homemade sled, lashing them down with thick rope. The load was substantial, easily a few £100. James harnessed himself to the sled with leather straps across his shoulders, and Tom, exhausted but determined, helped push from behind. The return journey was even more arduous than the outbound trip. The loaded sled was heavy, constantly threatening to slide sideways or dig into the deep snow. The fading light cast long, eerie shadows through the trees, and the cold seemed to intensify with the setting sun. Tom pushed, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision narrowing to the snow-covered ground and the dark, looming shape of the sled. Just as total darkness began to descend, the faint flicker of their cabin lamp appeared through the trees, a tiny, precious star in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Relief washed over Tom, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. Evelyn was waiting for them at the door, her face a mask of worry. Her eyes scanned them quickly, checking for signs of frostbite or injury. "You're back," she whispered, her voice thick with relief, as she helped James unharness himself from the sled. "Thank God!" As they brought the precious load of wood inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloped Tom. He collapsed onto the floor by the stove, aching in every muscle, but filled with a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had faced the Yukon, and he had done his part. James, though weary, had a glint of determination in his eyes. "We'll need to go back for the rest tomorrow, Evelyn," he said, looking at the dwindling indoor woodpile. "If this cold holds, we'll need every piece." Evelyn nodded, her expression grim but resolute. They had won a small victory, secured a temporary reprieve, but the winter, vast and relentless, was still out there, waiting. and the battle for survival had only just begun. The sun rose on another day of brutal cold, its light harsh and unforgiving against the pristine snow. Inside the cabin, the mood was a delicate balance of relief and renewed apprehension. The wood brought in yesterday offered a temporary reprieve, but James knew it wasn't enough. The outdoor thermometer still clung stubbornly to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that turned breath into ice crystals and metal into a weapon against bare skin. The wind's died down, James observed, gazing out the window, which Evelyn had uncovered slightly for a few moments of precious light. But that just means the cold settled in deeper. It'll be a good day for hauling, but a dangerous one for exposure. Evelyn prepared a meagre breakfast of cornmeal mush, stirring it slowly in a cast-iron pot over the stove. The flour, once a generous sack, was noticeably lighter. Their dried salmon and salt pork stores, though carefully rationed, were also dwindling. The small squirrel from days ago had been a welcome but fleeting addition. "We need more protein, James," Evelyn said, her voice flat. "The rabbit traps have been empty for 2 days, and the squirrel population seems to have vanished." James nodded grimly. The small game that usually supplemented their diet had become scarce. In such extreme cold, most animals hunkered down, conserving energy, making them almost impossible to find or trap. The larger game, moose, caribou, were even harder to track in the deep snow, and a single missed shot in this weather could mean freezing to death before he could retrieve his kill. "I'll check the main trapline this afternoon," James decided, putting down his empty mush bowl. "The one by the frozen creek. Maybe a fox or a lynx." Hunting larger predators, especially in these conditions, was a perilous undertaking. Foxes and lynx were cunning, their senses acute, and they could be dangerous when cornered. But the need for food was growing, a silent, gnawing whisper that threatened to become a roar. Tom listened to his parents, his small brow furrowed. He understood the gravity of their situation. He often dreamed of fresh meat, the rich taste of roasted rabbit, or the fatty warmth of moose stew. Now, those dreams felt like distant, unattainable luxuries. "Can I come with you, Papa?" Tom asked, his voice eager, though tinged with apprehension. "I can help carry the traps." James looked at his son, then at Evelyn. Evelyn's lips were pressed into a thin line. The thought of Tom facing the extreme cold and potential dangers of the trapline was a difficult one. But James also knew the boy's spirit, his growing maturity, and the need for him to learn these vital skills. "No, Tom," Evelyn interjected softly before James could speak. "It's too cold for you to be out there alone with your papa all day. You helped enough yesterday. You stay here with me and help mend the blankets. We need to make sure every stitch is strong." Tom's shoulders slumped slightly, but he didn't argue. He understood. His mother's words were not a rebuke, but a careful calculation of risk. "She's right, son," James said, placing a reassuring hand on Tom's shoulder. "Your job today is to keep the cabin warm and help your mama, and that's just as important as anything I do out there." As James prepared to leave, bundling himself in extra layers of fur and canvas, Evelyn handed him a small pouch of dried berries. "For energy, James. And don't stay out too long. If the wind picks up or the light starts to fade, you turn back. Do you hear me?" "I hear you, Evelyn," he promised, kissing her forehead, his lips surprisingly warm despite the cold. "And I'll be careful." He took his rifle, checked his ammunition, and slipped out the door, the cold air rushing in to fill the space he left behind. The cabin immediately felt emptier, the silence more profound. Tom spent the morning helping Evelyn mend blankets, his small fingers surprisingly nimble with the needle and thread. He learned how to patch worn spots, how to reinforce frayed edges, how to turn an old, thin blanket into a layered shield against the cold. Evelyn taught him about the different properties of wool and fur, how to choose the right thread, how to make each stitch count. "Every patch is a prayer, Tom," she said, her voice soft. "A prayer for warmth, a prayer for safety. Never waste a stitch." As they worked, Evelyn told him stories of her own childhood, of harsh winters on her family's farm, of how her mother had taught her to spin wool and weave cloth. She spoke of resilience, of resourcefulness, of the quiet strength that ran through generations of women in the wilderness. But as the afternoon wore on, a new anxiety began to settle in. James should have been back by now, or at least visible on the horizon. The light outside was fading fast, and a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of wind had begun to stir the snow. Evelyn went to the window, pulling aside the quilt covering. The world outside was a canvas of deepening shadows, the trees dark silhouettes against a bruised purple sky. There was no sign of James. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "He'll be all right, Mama," Tom said again, sensing her growing fear. But this time his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "I know," Evelyn replied, but her voice was tight. She lit another oil lamp, its light doing little to dispel the growing darkness outside. She stoked the fire, adding more wood, as if the extra heat could somehow draw James home. The waiting was the hardest part, a torment that gnawed at her insides. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made her jump. She imagined James lost in the deepening snow, his hands numb, his body freezing. She pictured him facing a hungry lynx, his rifle jammed, his strength failing. Just as the last vestiges of twilight vanished and total darkness enveloped the cabin, a sound echoed from outside. Not the thud of snowshoes, but a dull, guttural thump. Evelyn froze, her hand flying to her mouth. It sounded like a body falling. She snatched the rifle from its resting place above the door, her hands surprisingly steady. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "stay by the stove. Don't open the door for anyone but Papa. Do you hear me?" Tom, his face pale in the flickering lamplight, nodded, his eyes wide with fear. He watched his mother, a small woman suddenly transformed into a fierce protector, as she slowly approached the door. She unbarred it with a creak, pushing it open just an inch, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. "James," she called, her voice trembling. "James, is that you?" A low groan answered her. It was James. But something was wrong. She pulled the door open fully, her heart leaping into her throat. James was lying in the snow, a dark, heavy mass beside him. He was barely conscious, his face contorted in pain, his arm clutched tightly to his chest. "I got a lynx," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "But it got me too. Broke my arm, I think." The dark mass beside him was indeed a large lynx, its mottled fur covered in blood. It lay still, its predatory life extinguished. Evelyn dropped the rifle and rushed to James, her fear for his life momentarily overcoming her horror at his injury. Tom, seeing his father, cried out and ran to help. Together they struggled to pull James, heavy and in pain, into the cabin. The lynx, a grim trophy, would have to wait. Inside, Evelyn quickly assessed the damage. James's left arm was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle. His face was pale, his lips blue from the cold, and a deep gash bled freely on his forehead, where he must have hit something during the struggle. "Get water, Tom," Evelyn commanded, her voice sharp with urgency. "And more rags! Quickly." Tom, overcoming his initial shock, moved with a speed he didn't know he possessed. He grabbed the water bucket, scooped clean snow into it, and placed it on the stove to melt. He tore strips from an old clean linen shirt, his small hands fumbling with the fabric. Evelyn, meanwhile, carefully removed James's outer layers, her fingers gentle despite the urgency. She cleaned the wound on his forehead with melted snow, her heart aching at the sight of his pain. "I heard it coming," James mumbled, his eyes fluttering. "Managed to get a shot, but it jumped me. Got my arm, damned cat." Evelyn knew the story without him telling it. A lynx, desperate and hungry in the extreme cold, had probably ambushed him near the trapline. James, with his years of experience, would have fought back, but a broken arm in the wilderness was a catastrophic injury. She worked quickly, her mind racing. They had no doctor, no medicine, only her wits, her limited supplies, and the knowledge passed down from her own mother. She found 2 thin, sturdy pieces of split kindling, perfect for splinting. She boiled water to sterilize a needle and thread, a small, grim task. "This is going to hurt, James," she warned, her voice soft but firm as she prepared to set his arm. "But you have to stay still." James nodded, gritting his teeth, his eyes squeezed shut. Tom watched, wide-eyed, as his mother, with a strength that belied her small frame, gently but firmly manipulated his father's broken arm, aligning the bone. James cried out, a raw primal sound of pain, but he didn't move. Evelyn quickly applied the splints, wrapping them tightly with strips of clean cloth, making sure the arm was secure. Then she stitched the gash on his forehead, her hand steady, her movements precise. She had never done anything like this before, but in that moment, instinct and necessity guided her. Finally, she gave James a strong brew of willow bark tea, a natural painkiller and fever reducer, then helped him into his bunk, covering him with every blanket they had. He drifted into a restless sleep, his breathing shallow. Tom sat by the stove watching his father, his small body trembling. The lynx now lying outside represented both a triumph and a tragedy. They had meat, a precious source of protein that could sustain them for weeks, but the cost was immense. His father, their strongest protector, was gravely injured. Evelyn sat beside Tom, pulling him close. She was exhausted, her hands still trembling from the ordeal, but her eyes held a fierce, unyielding light. "We'll be all right, Tom," she whispered, her voice full of a strength that amazed even herself. "We'll be all right. We always are." But as she looked at her husband, pale and still in his bunk, and then at her son, his face streaked with tears and fear, she knew the real test of this winter had just begun. James was injured, and the bitter cold of the Yukon showed no signs of relenting. Their survival now depended more than ever on her strength, her ingenuity, and Tom's growing courage. The whispers of hunger might have been silenced for a time, but the challenges of a Yukon winter were relentless, and they had just entered a new, terrifying chapter. The days that followed James's injury blurred into a relentless cycle of tasks and anxieties. Evelyn's quiet strength, once a comforting undercurrent in their lives, now became the driving force of their survival. She moved through the cabin with a grim efficiency, her mind constantly calculating, planning, adapting. James's recovery was slow and painful. The fever persisted for several days, his body racked with shivers and sweat. Evelyn nursed him tirelessly, administering willow bark tea every few hours, changing his bandages and keeping a meticulous eye on the wound on his forehead, fearing infection more than anything. In the wilderness, a simple cut could turn deadly without proper care. She remembered old Mrs. Dawson, just a few miles downriver, who had lost a finger to an infected splinter 2 winters ago. The memory was a stark warning. With James incapacitated, every chore that had once been his fell to Evelyn and Tom. Tom, at 10 years old, stepped into his new responsibilities with a solemn dedication that astonished Evelyn. He was no longer just a boy. He was the man of the house, a small but unyielding pillar of support. His most critical duty was the fire. Evelyn taught him the nuances of fire management that James had typically handled for the overnight hours. Pine for starting, Tom, quick and hot, but oak and birch for lasting. You bank it deep with the coals at the bottom, just enough air to let it breathe, but not enough to burn through too fast. Tom listened intently, his small hands carefully placing logs in the stove, adjusting the damper with a concentration that belied his age. He understood that the fire was their lifeblood, a constant battle against the encroaching cold. He would wake every 2 hours, sometimes even more frequently, to check the embers, adding a piece or two, ensuring the cabin never slipped into dangerous frigidity. The lynx meat, though a grim reminder of James's ordeal, was a blessing. Evelyn, with Tom's help, spent hours preparing it. She carefully sliced thin strips of meat, salting them heavily, and then hung them from hooks near the stove, utilizing the cabin's ambient warmth for drying. She knew the process would be slow, but it was essential to preserve every ounce of this precious protein. The rich, gamey scent of the drying meat mingled with the familiar smell of pine smoke, creating a strange, primal perfume that filled their home. Outside, the cold remained a relentless adversary. The outdoor thermometer still registered in the -30s and -40s, and the snow lay deep, unbroken. James's arm, though splintered, made it impossible for him to tend the outdoor traps or replenish their wood supply. Evelyn knew she couldn't manage the heavy labour of felling trees alone, and Tom, despite his willingness, was still too small for such dangerous work. Their indoor woodpile, which had seemed so robust just a week ago, was visibly shrinking. Evelyn made the difficult decision to ration it more severely. Instead of maintaining a comfortable 60 degrees Fahrenheit near the stove, she aimed for a tolerable 50 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, letting it drop closer to 40 degrees Fahrenheit at night, relying on extra blankets and their body heat for warmth. "We need to go out for more wood, Mama," Tom said one afternoon, his voice quiet but firm, looking at the dwindling stack. "I can help you pull the sled." Evelyn looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of pride and fear. He was so young, yet so ready to face the dangers of the wilderness. "We can gather some deadfall, Tom," she conceded, knowing that collecting smaller, already fallen branches was less dangerous than felling a tree, but still incredibly arduous in the deep snow. But we won't go far, not while your father is like this. The next morning, bundled in their warmest clothes, Evelyn and Tom ventured out. Evelyn took James's old axe, its familiar weight feeling heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. Tom carried a small hatchet and pulled the empty sled. The cold was a physical presence wrapping around them, stealing their breath. Evelyn struggled through the deep snow, breaking trail for Tom, her muscles protesting with every step. Her hands, unaccustomed to the heavy axe, quickly grew numb. They found a few downed trees, their branches brittle with cold. Evelyn chopped at them with grim determination, the axe ringing hollowly in the frigid air. Tom helped break off smaller branches, stacking them carefully on the sled. It was slow, back-breaking work, and the small pile of wood they managed to collect felt like a pittance compared to their needs. "This won't last long, Mama," Tom observed, his voice tinged with discouragement, as they hauled the heavy sled back to the cabin. "I know, son," Evelyn replied, her breath misting in the air, "but it's enough for now. We take what the forest gives us." Back in the cabin, the sight of James, pale and still in his bunk, was a constant reminder of their precarious situation. His arm throbbed relentlessly, and the gash on his forehead, though clean, was a vivid purple line against his skin. Evelyn continued her vigil, her hands a constant blur of activity, mending, cooking, tending to James, and constantly checking their dwindling supplies. One evening, as Tom was diligently tending the fire, ensuring a steady glow of embers, James stirred in his bunk, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "Evelyn," he rasped, his voice weak, "how are the traps?" Evelyn paused, a small smile touching her lips. "Empty, James, but we have the links, and Tom here has been doing a fine job with the fire." James looked at his son, a flicker of pride and gratitude in his eyes. "Good boy, Tom," he whispered, his voice still hoarse. "You're taking care of your mama." Tom beamed, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the stove. His father had noticed. He was doing his part, but as the days bled into weeks, the reality of their isolation began to take its toll. The lynx meat, though plentiful, grew monotonous. The flour sack was almost empty. The last of their dried potatoes and carrots were gone. The silence of the cabin, once a peaceful refuge, now felt heavy, oppressive. James's arm was slowly healing, the swelling gradually receding, but he was still a long way from being able to use it for heavy labour. And outside, the Yukon winter showed no signs of loosening its icy grip. The cold, though fluctuating, rarely rose above -20°F, and fresh snow seemed to fall every few days, burying their tracks, deepening their isolation. Evelyn found herself checking the window more frequently, a desperate hope in her eyes for a sign of milder weather, a break in the relentless white. But the landscape remained unchanged, an endless, frozen expanse, beautiful and deadly. The burden of their survival rested solely on her and Tom's shoulders, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that their resources were finite and time was running out. The quiet whispers of hunger and desperation were beginning to grow louder, echoing in the vast, unforgiving silence of the Yukon winter. Weeks crawled by, each day a mirror of the last, defined by the relentless cold and the gnawing anxiety of dwindling supplies. James's arm, though still stiff and unusable for heavy tasks, was slowly mending. He could move his fingers now, and the fever had finally broken, leaving him weak but lucid. He would spend hours by the stove, his good arm resting on his knee, his eyes fixed on the flames, a silent, brooding presence. His spirit, however, remained as unyielding as the frozen landscape outside. Evelyn, with Tom's unwavering help, had become a formidable force. Her hands, once accustomed to the delicate work of mending and baking, now deftly wielded James's axe for lighter chopping, or meticulously set snares for the elusive rabbits that might still be moving. She had rationed their remaining flour to a few spoonfuls a day, stretching it with melted snow and dried berries to make thin, tasteless gruel. The last of the dried potatoes and carrots had long been consumed. The smoked lynx meat was their primary source of sustenance, but even that was dwindling, each strip a reminder of their precarious existence. The silence of the cabin, once comforting, now felt heavy, pressing down on them. The lack of conversation, the absence of James's booming laughter, or his stories of the trail created a void that even the crackle of the fire couldn't fill. Tom often caught Evelyn staring out the window, a distant, worried look in her eyes, a silent prayer for a break in the relentless white. "Mama," Tom said one frigid morning, looking at the almost empty stack of dried lynx meat. "We need to find more food. The traps haven't caught anything in days." Evelyn nodded, her face grim. "I know, son. The small game are too smart or too scarce. They're hunkered down just like us. But we can't hunker forever." She had an idea, a desperate one, born of necessity. "We'll try the river," she announced, her voice filled with a determination that belied her fear. "The fish might be sluggish, but they're still there. James taught me how to make an ice chisel." James, overhearing from his bunk, stirred. "Dangerous, Evelyn," he rasped, his voice weak. "The ice can be thin near the currents, and the cold, you won't last long out there." "We have no choice, James," Evelyn replied, her gaze firm. "We can't starve." The next day, Evelyn and Tom bundled themselves in every layer they owned. Evelyn took James's old ice chisel, a heavy, sharp-pointed tool made from tempered steel. Tom carried a small bucket for fish and a length of stout rope. The outdoor temperature hovered at -35°F, and the wind, though light, seemed to find every exposed patch of skin. The river, a mile from their cabin, was a vast frozen expanse, its surface a mosaic of ridged ice and wind-swept snow. Evelyn moved cautiously, testing each step with the chisel, listening for the ominous crack that would signal thin ice. Tom followed close behind, his eyes darting nervously across the desolate landscape. They found a spot where the current ran strong beneath the ice, a place James had often fished in the summer. Evelyn began to chip away at the thick ice, her movements slow and deliberate, the chisel ringing against the frozen surface with a monotonous clang. It was incredibly hard work, the impact jarring her arm, sending shivers through her body. Tom helped clear the ice chips, constantly moving to keep warm. After nearly an hour of grueling labour, a small hole, barely a foot wide, opened to the dark, swirling water below. Evelyn peered into it, her breath misting in the frigid air. The water was dark, opaque, offering no glimpse of movement. "Now we wait," she said, her voice tinged with discouragement. She improvised a rudimentary fishing line from a length of thin twine, and a sharpened bone as a hook, baiting it with a small piece of lynx meat. She knew it was a long shot. They waited. Two small figures huddled by a hole in the ice, their breath hanging like ghosts in the still, cold air. The silence of the river was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the ice and the faint whistle of the wind. Tom's fingers and toes grew numb despite his thick mittens and boots. Despair began to creep in, a cold, insidious feeling that threatened to overwhelm him. Just as Evelyn was about to give up, a sudden tug on the line. Her eyes snapped open, a flicker of fierce hope igniting within them. She pulled, slowly, carefully, her muscles tensing. A dark shape broke the surface, a small, sluggish whitefish, its scales dulled by the cold. "A fish!" Tom cried, his voice hoarse with excitement. "Mama, you got a fish!" Evelyn quickly unhooked it, placing the frozen fish into the bucket. It was small, but it was a victory, a defiant act against the unforgiving winter. They caught two more small fish before the light began to fade, their hands numb, their bodies aching, but their spirits buoyed by the success. As they trudged back towards the cabin, the sun sinking below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the snow, a new sound cut through the silence, a long, mournful howl. Then another, closer this time. Evelyn froze, her hand instinctively going to the small axe at her belt. Wolves. Desperate, hungry wolves drawn by the scent of the lynx meat drying in their cabin, or perhaps by the fresh fish they carried. "Stay close, Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Keep the sled between us, and don't make a sound." Tom's heart hammered against his ribs. He had heard his father's stories of wolves, powerful and cunning predators. He gripped the rope of the sled, his small body trembling. The howling grew closer, a chilling chorus that spoke of primal hunger. Through the deepening twilight, Evelyn saw them. Three dark shapes moving silently and swiftly through the trees, their eyes gleaming like embers in the fading light. They were large, powerful animals, their breath pluming in the cold air. "Keep walking, Tom," Evelyn commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "Slowly. Don't run." She knew that running would only trigger their predatory instincts. They walked, their pace agonizingly slow, the wolves shadowing them, a silent, menacing escort. Evelyn felt their eyes on her back, a primal awareness of being hunted. She glanced at the small axe in her hand, a pathetic defense against such powerful predators. Her only hope was the cabin, its distant light a beacon of safety. Just as the wolves seemed to gather, preparing for a charge, the faint but unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoed through the frozen air. The wolves, startled, hesitated. Then another shot, closer this time, and one of the dark shapes yelped, limping away into the trees. The other two, wary, followed. Evelyn and Tom froze, looking back towards the direction of the shots, and there, standing on the edge of the clearing near their cabin, his good arm holding his rifle, was James. He was pale, leaning heavily on the cabin wall, but his eyes were clear, his gaze fierce. He had seen them, he had heard the wolves, and despite his injury, he had protected his family. Evelyn ran, pulling Tom behind her towards the cabin. She reached James, throwing her uninjured arm around him, tears streaming down her frost-nipped cheeks. "James, you shouldn't have—" "Had to, Evelyn," he rasped, his eyes still scanning the tree line. "Couldn't let them get you, or the boy." He gestured to the two small fish in Tom's bucket. "Looks like you had some luck, though." Inside the cabin, the fire seemed to burn brighter, the warmth more comforting than ever. Tom, still trembling, huddled by the stove, watching his father with a newfound reverence. James, though injured, was still their protector, their anchor in the storm. Evelyn, her hands still shaking, prepared the fish, the fresh scent filling the cabin with a promise of sustenance. They had survived another day, another desperate encounter with the unforgiving wilderness, but the encounter with the wolves and James's courageous but dangerous intervention reinforced a chilling truth. The Yukon winter was relentless, and it would test their every limit, physical and mental, until the very last whisper of cold had passed. The adrenaline from the wolf encounter slowly faded, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. James, after the intense effort of firing the rifle, was weaker than ever. Evelyn helped him back to his bunk, his face ashen. His good arm, which had just wielded the heavy rifle, now trembled noticeably. The willow bark tea, though a painkiller, was no substitute for true rest and healing. "You took a terrible risk, James," Evelyn said, her voice a mix of relief and reproof as she covered him with blankets. "Your arm, and your strength." James merely closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. "Couldn't stand by, Evelyn, not with my family out there." His voice was barely a whisper. Tom, still shaken, sat by the stove watching the fish Evelyn was frying. The scent of fresh food, a rare luxury, filled the cabin, but his appetite was dulled by the night's events. He kept glancing at his father, then at the cabin door, as if expecting the wolves to return. Evelyn, though equally exhausted, had no time for rest. She cooked the fish meticulously, ensuring every edible part was utilized. She saved the bones for a future broth, another small act of defiance against the encroaching scarcity. As they ate, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and James's pained groans from his bunk. The next few days settled into a new, grim routine. James remained confined to his bunk, his recovery agonizingly slow. The effort of raising the rifle had set back the healing of his arm, and he was often feverish, his mind clouded by pain. Evelyn nursed him with an almost desperate tenderness, her hands a constant blur of activity. She changed his dressings, brewed stronger herbal teas from dried plants she had gathered in the summer, and whispered words of encouragement that she herself sometimes doubted. Tom's responsibilities deepened. He became the primary caretaker of the fire, waking faithfully every few hours through the night to feed the stove. He learned to conserve wood with an almost adult understanding, banking the coals with precision, selecting each piece of fuel with care. He also took on the task of checking the small rabbit snares near the cabin, a role that had previously been his father's. Bundled in his warmest clothes, Tom would venture out each morning, his small axe at his belt, a canvas bag for his findings. The cold was still brutal, often hovering in the -30s, but Tom moved with a new sense of purpose. He felt the weight of his family's survival on his small shoulders, a heavy but strangely empowering burden. The snares were often empty, a stark reminder of the wilderness's scarcity, but occasionally he would find a small rabbit, frozen solid, its fur ruffled by the wind. These were triumphs, small but significant. that brought a flicker of hope to Evelyn's eyes and a much-needed source of protein to their meagre diet. Tom learned to skin the rabbits himself, an unpleasant but necessary task, his fingers growing numb in the cold as he worked outside to keep the cabin clean. One afternoon, as Tom returned with a single, small rabbit, he found Evelyn standing by James's bunk, her hand on his forehead. Her face was etched with a profound weariness he had never seen before. "He's getting weaker, Tom," she said, her voice barely a whisper as James drifted in a fitful sleep. "The fever keeps coming back, and I don't know what else to do." Her eyes, usually so strong, were filled with unshed tears. Tom's heart sank. He looked at his father, pale and still, then at his mother. Her shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. The cabin, usually their refuge, suddenly felt like a prison. "We need help, Mama," Tom said, his voice trembling. "Maybe old man Dawson knows something. He's been here longer than anyone." Evelyn looked at him, a flicker of something akin to despair in her eyes. Old man Dawson lived nearly 10 miles downriver, a journey that would be perilous even for James at full strength. For Evelyn and Tom, with a sick man to leave behind, it seemed an impossible undertaking. "It's too far, Tom," she said, shaking her head slowly. "And with your father like this, I can't leave him, and you can't go alone." The reality of their isolation pressed down on them, suffocating and relentless. They were alone, utterly, terribly alone, in a vast, unforgiving wilderness, with a gravely injured father and dwindling hope. James stirred then, his eyes slowly opening. He looked at Evelyn, then at Tom, his gaze surprisingly clear. "The trappers," he rasped, his voice weak. "They usually pass through the canyon this time of year, headed south." Evelyn knelt by his bunk. "But James, the canyon is 3 days' journey even on snowshoes, and with this cold—" "It's our only chance," James interrupted, a spark of his old determination in his eyes. "Someone might pass, a supply train, a lone trapper. They might have medicine, or help." He looked at Tom, then back at Evelyn. "Tom's old enough to go with you. He knows the trails. You take the sled, the lynx hide. It's a good one. Might get you some flour, some quinine." Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. The canyon. It was a place of legends and dangers, a narrow, treacherous pass that wound through towering snow-covered cliffs. The journey would be brutal, exposed to the full force of the Yukon winter. But James was right. It was their only hope. The decision hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. To stay meant almost certain slow decline. To go meant risking everything on a desperate journey through a merciless landscape, with only her and her young son to face its perils. Evelyn looked at Tom, his small face pale but resolute. He met her gaze, his eyes mirroring her own fear, but also a fierce, unyielding resolve. "We'll do it," Evelyn finally said, her voice firm, the words a commitment that echoed in the silent cabin. "We'll go to the canyon." The weight of the decision settled over them, a new heavy burden, but beneath it, a fragile seed of hope had been planted, a desperate gamble against the unforgiving white. The journey to the canyon would be their greatest challenge yet, a test of their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering belief in each other. The decision to embark on the perilous journey to the canyon had been made, but the terror of it lingered, a cold knot in Evelyn's stomach. 3 days' travel, in this unforgiving cold, with her young son and James left behind, vulnerable and alone. It was a gamble of the highest stakes. Yet, looking at James, frail and pale in his bunk, and then at Tom, his small face etched with a mix of fear and brave determination, she knew there was no other choice. The next morning was a blur of frantic, meticulous preparation. Every item to be taken, every detail of their absence had to be carefully considered. Evelyn moved with a renewed sense of purpose, a fierce energy born of desperation. First, they had to prepare James for their absence. Evelyn spent hours by his side brewing a potent concentrate of willow bark tea, enough to last him for several days, and a weak gruel of dried berries and melted snow, easy for him to swallow. She carefully cleaned his arm wound again, rewrapping the splint, her fingers gentle. "I've left you enough food and tea for 4 days, James," she told him, her voice low and steady, "and the woodpile is full. Tom will have it banked good and deep before we leave. Just rest. Don't exert yourself." James merely nodded, his eyes heavy. "Be careful, Evelyn." And Tom, the canyon. It's not a place to be taken lightly. Next came the supplies for the journey. Evelyn and Tom laid out everything they owned that could be useful. The lynx hide, a beautiful thick pelt, was carefully folded and placed at the bottom of the sled. It was their currency, their last hope for medicine or provisions. Evelyn packed a small amount of pemmican, dried fish, and a few precious squares of molasses candy for quick energy. She meticulously checked her fire-starting kit, flint and steel, a small magnifying glass, and a tightly packed tin of char cloth. "Never know when you'll need a fire, Tom," she murmured, demonstrating how to make a tiny spark catch on the blackened cotton. "It's the difference between life and death." For their clothing, Evelyn layered their warmest woolens, fur-lined coats, heavy mittens, and thick wool socks. She made sure Tom had 2 pairs of his rabbit fur-lined moccasins, knowing that dry, warm feet were paramount. She also packed a small vial of bear grease, for chapped skin and to protect against frostbite. The sled, their homemade contraption of oak runners and canvas bed, was their lifeline. Tom helped Evelyn lash down their meagre supplies, testing the ropes, ensuring everything was secure. They would need every ounce of their strength to pull it through the deep snow. "We need a map, Mama," Tom said, looking at the featureless white outside the window. "Papa always has a map." Evelyn frowned. James did have a rudimentary map of their territory, painstakingly drawn over the years on a piece of cured hide. But it was crude, and the canyon itself was marked only by a vague, hand-drawn outline. She found it in James's small chest, a precious document. "Your father drew this, Tom," she explained, tracing a finger along the faded lines. "It shows the river and some of the old trapper trails. But the canyon, it's a labyrinth. We'll have to rely on our senses and what your father's taught us." James, from his bunk, offered what advice he could. "Follow the river ice for the first day, Evelyn. It's the fastest path. Then you'll bear east at the Twin Pines before the Big Bend. The canyon entrance is marked by a split rock, looks like a giant's tooth. You can't miss it." He paused, his breath catching. "And listen for the wind. The canyon wind, it's different. A deep, mournful sound, like a spirit crying." Evelyn listened, memorizing every word, every detail. James was essentially giving them a mental map, woven with his years of experience and his deep understanding of the land. Tom, meanwhile, was filled with a mix of excitement and trepidation. He had never been this far from the cabin, never on such a long journey. He thought of the stories his father told about the canyon, the towering cliffs, the echoes of the wind, the occasional sightings of mountain goats clinging to impossible ledges. It was a place of wild beauty and immense danger. The evening before their departure was quiet, almost sacred. Evelyn prepared their best meal yet, a thick stew made from the last of the dried fish and a few precious slices of lynx meat, flavoured with the last of their salt. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. James, though weak, ate with a quiet resolve, watching them, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the pain and the fear. As night fell, Evelyn banked the fire, carefully arranging the logs to burn slowly through the night. Tom, too, made sure his portion of the fire was well tended. This would be his last night of sleeping in a warm cabin for a while. Evelyn sat by James, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort and reassurance. "We'll be back, James," she promised, her voice firm, even though a part of her wondered if they truly would. "And we'll bring you back strong." James squeezed her hand, a faint smile touching his lips. "I know you will, Evelyn. You're the strongest woman I know." When Evelyn finally lay down in her bunk, pulling the heavy furs close, she felt the cold seep into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cabin. It was the cold of fear, of uncertainty, of the immense responsibility that now rested on her. She thought of Tom sleeping soundly in his bunk, and a surge of protective love washed over her. She would brave the canyon, she would face the wilderness, she would do whatever it took to keep her family safe. Outside, the Yukon winter held its breath, a vast white beast waiting for their desperate journey to begin. The air was still, silent, and bitterly cold. It was a cold that would test every fibre of their being, every ounce of their courage, and every thread of their hope. Their fate was now in their hands, 2 small figures against the unforgiving white. The dawn of their departure was a stark canvas of white and ice, the sky a dull, metallic grey. Evelyn and Tom stepped out of the cabin, leaving James to his solitary vigil. The weight of their mission pressed down on them, heavier than the cold that immediately pierced their many layers. They harnessed themselves to the sled, the links hide a silent prayer beneath their meagre supplies, and began their desperate journey. The first day was a grueling trek along the frozen river. The ice, treacherous and uneven, demanded every ounce of Evelyn's concentration. She tested each step, her eyes scanning for fissures, for the ominous dark patches that signalled thinness. Tom, though small, pulled with all his might, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision narrowed to the swirling snow kicked up by their feet. The wind, a constant sharp blade, cut through them, stinging exposed skin despite the bear grease Evelyn had applied. As they pushed deeper into the wilderness, the landscape transformed. The dense pine forests gave way to a more desolate, open terrain, where the wind had sculpted the snow into fantastical, merciless drifts. The twin pines, once a beacon, faded behind them, swallowed by the vast white. Evelyn relied on James's mental map, his voice a steady whisper in her mind. Bear east at the twin pines before the big bend. The canyon entrance is marked by a split rock, looks like a giant's tooth, you can't miss it. By late afternoon, the sun, a pale, anemic disk, began its swift descent, plunging the world into deepening shadows. Tom's exhaustion was evident. His steps faltered, and his face was pale with cold. Evelyn, though equally weary, forced herself to push on. The canyon entrance had to be near. Suddenly, towering above the snow-laden landscape, a colossal rock formation emerged from the deepening twilight. It was split down the middle, like a gigantic ancient tooth gnawing at the sky. The serpent's mouth, the entrance to the canyon. A wave of both dread and relief washed over Evelyn. They had found it. But with the discovery came a new, chilling sound. The canyon wind. It wasn't the sharp, biting wind of the open plains, but a deep, mournful howl, a resonant cry that seemed to echo from the very heart of the earth. A deep, mournful sound like a spirit crying, James's warning. The sound sent a shiver down Tom's spine, a primal fear of the unknown. Evelyn knew they couldn't enter the canyon in the fading light. They needed to make camp as close to its shelter as possible, but far enough to avoid any falling ice or snow from its towering walls. They found a small, relatively protected alcove at the base of a less precipitous cliff face, sheltered somewhat from the direct force of the wind. Building a fire was a desperate race against the plummeting temperatures. Evelyn's fingers, stiff and clumsy with cold, fumbled with the flint and steel. Tom, his teeth chattering, gathered dry tinder from beneath the snow-laden spruce boughs. Finally, a small tentative flame flickered to life, its warmth a defiant symbol against the encroaching darkness. They huddled by the fire, sharing a meagre supper of pemmican and melted snow, the canyon wind howling its relentless song around them. The towering walls of the canyon loomed in the darkness, vast and intimidating, promising both shelter and peril. Evelyn pulled Tom close, wrapping an extra blanket around him. His small body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the immense, terrifying unknown that lay ahead. "Tomorrow, Tom," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind's roar. "Tomorrow we enter the canyon, we find help." Tom nodded, burying his face deeper into her shoulder. He looked at the fire, its flames dancing against the impenetrable darkness, and knew that their courage, like that small fire, had to burn bright. The canyon, with its echoing winds and towering shadows, waited, and they, two small figures, were ready to face its embrace. The journey had truly begun. The morning brought no respite from the cold, only a stark, brutal clarity. The canyon entrance, the serpent's mouth, loomed before them, its colossal rock formations casting long blue shadows across the snow. The wind, though less furious than the night before, still whistled through the narrow pass, a constant chilling reminder of the dangers within. "Stay close, Tom," Evelyn commanded, her voice echoing faintly against the sheer rock walls. "And watch your footing. The ice can be tricky in here." They entered the canyon, the world immediately closing in around them. The towering cliffs, hundreds of feet high, blotted out much of the sky, creating a perpetual twilight. The air was still, heavy with an oppressive silence that amplified every crunch of their snowshoes, every creak of the sled. The canyon floor was a treacherous mosaic of ice and snow, carved by ancient forces, now a frozen labyrinth. Evelyn led the way, her eyes constantly scanning the rock faces above for signs of falling ice or snow. The path was narrow, winding between massive boulders draped in frozen waterfalls, their surfaces glistening like jagged teeth. The sled, heavy and cumbersome, often snagged on hidden rocks or dug deep into soft snowdrifts, demanding all their combined strength to free it. Tom, his small hands raw despite his mittens, pushed and pulled, his muscles screaming with exertion. The canyon wind, true to James's warning, was a peculiar entity. It didn't howl with the open fury of the plains, but rather sighed and moaned, a ghostly lament that seemed to follow their every step. It was a sound that spoke of isolation, of ancient spirits, and of the profound indifference of the wilderness. Hours passed in a grueling, silent struggle. The sun, when it managed to pierce the narrow opening of the canyon, cast only fleeting ethereal beams, illuminating patches of ice in a dazzling, blinding light. They saw no signs of trappers, no tracks in the pristine snow other than their own. The canyon was empty, a vast frozen tomb. Despair began to creep in, a cold, insidious feeling that threatened to overwhelm Evelyn. Had James been wrong? Had the trappers already passed, or chosen a different route? Was this journey, this desperate gamble, all for nothing? She pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the next step, on the rhythmic crunch of her snowshoes, on the small, determined figure of her son. Tom, despite his exhaustion, found a strange fascination in the canyon. The towering walls, the intricate ice formations, the sheer scale of it all. It was terrifying, but also breathtakingly beautiful. He imagined ancient spirits watching them, silent judges of their courage. He remembered his father's stories of the land, of its power and its secrets. He knew they had to keep going. By mid-afternoon, the canyon began to narrow further, forcing them to abandon the sled for a short, treacherous stretch. They unloaded their most vital supplies, the lynx hide, the fire-starting kit, their remaining food, and carried them by hand, carefully navigating a steep, icy incline. The sled, a heavy burden, had to be hauled over a particularly difficult section, costing them precious time and energy. As they finally emerged from the narrowest part of the canyon, the path opened slightly, leading to a small, flat clearing. And there, etched faintly in the snow, were tracks. Not animal tracks, but human tracks. Snowshoe tracks, partially obscured by fresh snowfall but unmistakably recent. Evelyn gasped, a surge of adrenaline shooting through her weary body. "Tom, look, tracks, we're not alone." Tom, his eyes wide with renewed hope, rushed forward, tracing the faint imprints with his finger. "They're going south, Mama, just like Papa said." The tracks were a lifeline, a tangible sign that their desperate journey might not be in vain. Evelyn felt a fresh wave of determination. They were close, they had to be. But as they followed the tracks, the sun began its final descent, casting the canyon walls in a deep, ominous purple. The cold intensified, and the wind, now a steady, piercing shriek, began to whip through the canyon with renewed force. They couldn't make it to wherever the tracks led before dark. "We have to make camp, Tom," Evelyn said, her voice strained, "and keep a sharp eye out. We don't know who made these tracks." They found a small overhang offering minimal shelter and quickly set about building a fire. The tracks, a beacon of hope, also brought a new layer of anxiety. Were these trappers friendly, or were they desperate like themselves and potentially dangerous? The Yukon, in its unforgiving embrace, often brought out the best and worst in people. As the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls, Evelyn pulled out the lynx hide, running her hand over its soft, thick fur. This was their offering, their plea for help. Tom huddled close, watching the flames, his mind filled with images of the tracks, of the unknown people who had passed this way, and of his father, waiting, alone, in their distant cabin. The canyon wind howled its mournful song, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. But tonight it was mingled with a fragile hope, a desperate prayer that the tracks they followed would lead them not just to help, but to a way back home, to James, before the unforgiving white claimed them all. The next morning a chilling discovery awaited them. The human tracks they had followed led not to a trapper's camp, but to an abandoned, partially collapsed lean-to shelter, barely more than a windbreak. Inside, frozen stiff, lay a lone trapper, his face gaunt, his eyes wide with the terror of his last moments. His supplies were scattered, meagre and useless. He had clearly succumbed to the cold and starvation, a stark, grim warning of the canyon's merciless nature. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea, pulling Tom back from the horrific scene. The hope the tracks had ignited now turned to ash. "He didn't make it, Mama," Tom whispered, his voice trembling. His innocence had been brutally shattered. Evelyn, though shaken, forced herself to be pragmatic. They salvaged what little they could. A rusted tin cup, a few lengths of sturdy twine, and a small dull hatchet. The trapper's rifle was frozen solid. Useless. They couldn't stay. The dead man was a grim omen, and the canyon with its echoing winds seemed to mock their desperate quest. They continued south, the tracks of the dead trapper now a haunting reminder of their own mortality. The canyon stretched endlessly, its towering walls a constant oppressive presence. The cold gnawed at them, seeping into their bones, and their meagre food supplies were dwindling fast. Evelyn found herself rationing their pemmican to a few bites a day, and the fish they had caught felt like a distant memory. Tom, though he tried to be brave, often shivered uncontrollably, his small body struggling against the relentless cold. Just as despair threatened to consume them, a new sound cut through the canyon's mournful lament, the distant rhythmic jingle of bells. Evelyn froze, her heart leaping. Bells! It could only mean one thing: a dog team, a supply train, or perhaps even another trapper. Hope, fierce and fragile, flared within her. "Tom, do you hear that?" she cried, her voice hoarse with excitement. "Bells! Someone's coming!" Tom, his eyes wide with disbelief, listened intently. Yes, faint but unmistakable, the cheerful jingle of bells. He felt a surge of energy, pushing away the cold and the fear. They weren't alone. They pushed forward with renewed vigour, following the direction of the sound. The canyon walls began to open slightly and the light grew brighter, and then, around a bend in the icy path, they saw them. A team of 6 sturdy huskies pulling a heavily laden sled, their breath pluming in the cold air. Behind them a lone figure bundled in furs walking with a steady practiced gait. "Hello!" Evelyn shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "Hello there!" The trapper, a grizzled man with a kind face framed by a thick beard, stopped his team, his eyes widening in surprise. He was clearly not expecting to see a woman and a boy in the depths of the canyon. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice deep and friendly. "What in tarnation are you folks doing out here?" Evelyn, tears streaming down her frost-nipped cheeks, quickly explained their desperate situation. James's injury, the dwindling supplies, their perilous journey to the canyon. She pulled out the lynx hide, offering it as payment, her voice trembling with the urgency of their plea. The trapper, whose name was Silas, listened with a grave expression, his eyes taking in their exhausted, cold-bitten faces. He looked at the lynx hide, then back at Evelyn. "No need for payment, Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle. "Anyone out here knows what a Yukon winter can do. You need help, and you've found it." Silas immediately set about helping them. He shared his hot coffee and pemmican, a feast for their starved bodies. He examined James's crude map, nodding at the landmarks. He even had a small medical kit containing antiseptic and some quinine, a godsend for James's fever. "We'll get you back to your cabin," Silas promised, his voice firm, "and we'll get your husband the medicine he needs. It'll be slow going, but my dogs are strong, and we've got supplies." Evelyn felt a wave of profound relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. They were saved. James would have his medicine. They would have food. They would survive. Tom, huddled by Silas's warm fire, watched the trapper with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The wilderness, which had been so cruel, had finally offered a hand of salvation. The journey back to their cabin was still arduous, but it was filled with a new kind of hope. Silas, with his experienced dog team and his vast knowledge of the trails, made the journey faster and safer. He taught Evelyn and Tom about navigating by the stars, about reading the subtle shifts in the wind, about the signs of approaching storms. He shared stories of his own decades in the Yukon, tales of hardship and resilience, of the unforgiving beauty of the land. As they approached their cabin, the smoke from its chimney a familiar, comforting sight, Evelyn's heart pounded with anticipation. James. He was waiting, and they were bringing him help. The unforgiving white had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but they had not broken. They had found their way through the labyrinth of ice, and emerged, battered but not defeated, into the fragile light of hope. The reunion was a moment of raw, overwhelming emotion. James, pale and weak, struggled to sit up as Evelyn and Tom burst through the cabin door, Silas following close behind. Relief washed over his face as he saw them, safe and sound, and then his eyes fell on Silas, a silent question in their depths. "Silas, a trapper," Evelyn explained, her voice thick with tears of joy and exhaustion. "He found us. He has medicine, James. Quinine." Silas, with a quiet efficiency, immediately set to work. He examined James's arm, nodding approvingly at Evelyn's splint work, then cleaned and redressed the wound on his forehead. He administered a dose of quinine, a bitter but life-saving remedy for James's lingering fever. He then helped Evelyn prepare a hearty meal from his own generous supplies, thick slices of bacon, dried beans, and real coffee, a luxury they hadn't tasted in weeks. Over the next few days, Silas became an invaluable presence in their small cabin. He was a man of few words but immense capability. He checked their traps, bringing back a steady supply of rabbits, and even a plump ptarmigan, fresh meat that revitalized their weakened bodies. He replenished their dwindling woodpile, felling trees with a strength that belied his age, his axe strokes precise and powerful. He taught Tom new knot-tying techniques, how to identify different animal tracks in the snow, and the best places to set snares for maximum yield. James, slowly regaining his strength, listened intently to Silas, absorbing his wisdom. They shared stories of the Yukon, tales of brutal winters and narrow escapes, of the camaraderie that bound men and women in this unforgiving land. The quinine worked its magic, slowly but surely breaking James's fever, allowing his arm to truly begin its healing process. As James grew stronger, the cabin, once a place of quiet desperation, began to fill with a renewed sense of purpose and even laughter. Tom, emboldened by Silas's presence and his father's improving health, explored the nearby woods with a new confidence, his small axe now a tool of growing skill rather than just a symbol. Evelyn, relieved of the crushing burden of sole responsibility, found her own spirits lifting, her hands busy with the comforting routines of a well-supplied home. After a week, with James well on the road to recovery and their supplies replenished, Silas announced it was time for him to move on. "The South Trails are calling," he said, his eyes twinkling, "and I've got a long way to go before spring." Evelyn and James tried to offer him payment, the lynx hide and what little gold dust James had panned in the summer, but Silas waved it away. "No need, folks. We all help each other out here. You'll do the same for someone else someday." He gave Tom a sturdy, well-made hunting knife, a gift that brought a flush of pride to the boy's cheeks. "Keep learning, son," he advised. "The wilderness has plenty to teach." As Silas hitched his dog team, the bells jingling cheerfully in the crisp morning air, Evelyn and James stood on the porch watching him go. He was a fleeting presence, a guardian angel sent by the Yukon itself, but his impact on their lives was profound. He had brought them not just medicine and supplies, but renewed hope, a reminder that even in the deepest isolation, humanity's spirit of kindness and resilience could shine through. The winter still stretched long and cold before them, but the Baker family faced it with a new strength. James, though his arm would take months to fully heal, was alive and recovering. Evelyn, her spirit revitalized, knew she could face any challenge, and Tom, no longer just a boy, had emerged from the crucible of their ordeal with a newfound maturity, a deeper understanding of the wilderness, and an unshakable belief in his family's ability to survive. The unforgiving white had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but they had not broken. They had found their way through the labyrinth of ice, and emerged, battered but not defeated, into the fragile light of hope, ready to face whatever the Yukon still had in store. The weeks that followed Silas's departure were a period of steady, if slow, recovery. James's arm, though still in its splint, showed marked improvement. He could move it gingerly, and the pain, though still present, was a dull ache rather than a searing torment. The quinine had broken the fever completely, and with a consistent diet of fresh meat and Silas's remaining provisions, James slowly regained his strength. He spent his days by the stove, watching Tom tend the fire, offering quiet advice, his eyes following Evelyn as she moved about the cabin. His presence, even in his weakened state, was a comforting anchor. Tom, now armed with Silas's hunting knife and his new knowledge of traps and tracks, took on the role of the family's primary hunter. He ventured out daily, not far from the cabin, checking the snares Silas had helped him set, and sometimes even tracking small game. The wilderness, once a place of terrifying unknowns, now felt a little less daunting, a little more familiar. He learned to move silently through the snow, to read the subtle signs of animal presence, to set his traps with patience and precision. He brought back rabbits, ptarmigan, and even a few squirrels, small victories that kept their larder from emptying completely. Evelyn, with James recovering, found her own burden lightened. She focused on the domestic tasks, mending, cooking, and ensuring the cabin remained a warm, secure haven. She continued to ration their flour and dried goods, but the fresh meat from Tom's hunts meant they were no longer on the brink of starvation. The long evenings were filled with stories from James, tales of his early days in the Yukon, of the gold rush, and of the many characters he had met. Tom listened intently, his imagination ignited by his father's words, while Evelyn spun wool by the lamplight, her hands moving with a steady, comforting rhythm. The winter, however, was far from over. The cold remained relentless, often dropping back into the -30s and -40s. Fresh snow continued to fall, burying the trails and deepening their isolation. The indoor woodpile, despite Tom's efforts at foraging deadfall, was once again dwindling. James, though stronger, still couldn't wield an axe or a crosscut saw with his injured arm. The heavy labour of felling trees and hauling logs remained beyond their current capabilities. One morning James looked at the thermometer, then at the almost empty woodpile, his brow furrowed. "We need more wood, Evelyn," he stated, his voice grim, "and I can't do it. Not yet." Evelyn nodded, her heart sinking. She knew. She had seen the signs, felt the cabin grow colder despite Tom's diligent fire tending. "Tom and I can try to find more deadfall," she offered, though the thought of another arduous trip filled her with dread. James shook his head. "Deadfall won't be enough. We need proper logs, and the main wood lot is too far for you two to haul alone, especially with the snow getting deeper." He paused, a deep worry clouding his eyes. "There's an old trapper's cache about a day's journey north near the big bend of the river. It might have some seasoned wood, and maybe some supplies." Evelyn's eyes widened. The Big Bend was a notorious stretch of the river, known for its strong currents and unpredictable ice. And a trapper's cache, while a potential godsend, could also be empty, or worse, guarded. "A cache, James? Whose cache?" "Old Man Hemlock," James replied, his voice low. "He disappeared years ago, never came back from a winter run. His cache might still be there. It's a long shot, but it's our best one." He looked at Evelyn, his gaze pleading. "You and Tom could make it there and back in 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather holds. You could take the sled." Evelyn hesitated. The thought of another long journey, another desperate gamble, filled her with trepidation. But the alternative, running out of wood, freezing in their own cabin, was unthinkable. She looked at Tom, who was listening intently, his small face reflecting her own fear, but also a growing resolve. "We'll do it, James," Evelyn finally said, her voice firm, a new determination hardening her features. "We'll go to Old Man Hemlock's cache." The decision once again was made. The Yukon winter, relentless and unforgiving, had presented them with another challenge, another desperate choice. But the Baker family, tempered by hardship and bound by an unbreakable will, was ready to face it. The journey to Hemlock's cache, a gamble against the odds, would be their next trial in the unforgiving white. The morning after the decision, the cabin buzzed with a familiar anxious energy. Evelyn and Tom prepared for their journey to Hemlock's cache, a venture even more uncertain than their trip to the canyon. James, though confined to his bunk, offered what advice he could about the Big Bend's treacherous ice and the subtle signs of a hidden cache. He watched them go with a stoic expression, but his eyes held a deep, unspoken fear. The journey north was a brutal test of endurance. The Big Bend lived up to its reputation. The river ice was riddled with cracks and pressure ridges, demanding careful navigation. Evelyn, wielding an ice chisel, probed ahead, while Tom, pulling the empty sled, learned to read the ice, his young eyes sharp and attentive. The wind, a constant companion, whipped fine snow into their faces, and the cold gnawed at their exposed skin. After a day of grueling travel, they found the Big Bend, a wide, sweeping curve in the river. And there, tucked away in a dense thicket of spruce, almost invisible under a heavy blanket of snow, was a small, crude structure. Old Man Hemlock's cache. It was a simple log lean-to, carefully constructed to protect its contents from animals and the elements. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled Evelyn's knees washed over her. They had found it. But the real question remained, what lay inside? With trembling hands, Evelyn pried open the frozen door. Inside, stacked neatly, were several cords of seasoned dry wood, birch and spruce, perfect for their stove, and tucked away in a corner, a small canvas-wrapped bundle. Evelyn opened it to reveal a small bag of flour, a tin of dried fruit, and miraculously a bottle of quinine. "Tom, look," Evelyn cried, her voice choked with emotion, holding up the bottle. "Quinine! For Papa!" Tom's face lit up with a joy that banished the cold and exhaustion. They had found it. Not just wood, but medicine, the very thing that could truly heal his father. The journey, the fear, the hardship, it had all been worth it. The return journey, though still arduous, was filled with a new, vibrant hope. The sled, now laden with precious wood and supplies, felt lighter. They pushed through the snow, their steps more determined, their hearts buoyed by the promise of recovery. Back at the cabin, James's face, pale and drawn, transformed at the sight of the quinine. Evelyn immediately administered a dose, and over the next few days the medicine worked its slow, steady magic. James's fever completely abated, the pain in his arm lessened, and a healthy colour slowly returned to his cheeks. With the replenished woodpile, the cabin once again became a sanctuary of warmth, and with the new flour and dried fruit, Evelyn prepared nourishing meals that helped James regain his strength. As James recovered, the family settled into a new rhythm. His arm, though still splintered, allowed him to move about more freely, offering advice and sharing stories. Tom, now a seasoned young hunter, continued to tend the traps, his skills honed by necessity. Evelyn, her spirit restored, managed the cabin with renewed vigour. The bitterest days of winter slowly began to recede. The sun, though still low in the sky, lingered a little longer each day, casting a softer, warmer light on the snow-covered landscape. The outdoor thermometer, while still below freezing, crept slowly upward. One afternoon, James, his arm finally out of its splint, stood on the porch gazing at the horizon. A faint, almost imperceptible green tinge was appearing on the distant spruce boughs. The river, though still frozen, showed subtle signs of shifting, a faint groan beneath the ice. "Spring," James whispered, a profound sense of relief in his voice. "She's coming, Evelyn. She's finally coming." Evelyn joined him, pulling Tom close. The air still held a chill, but it was a different kind of cold, a cold that promised change, not despair. The long, brutal winter had tested them to their very limits, pushing their physical and mental endurance beyond anything they had imagined. They had faced starvation, injury, and the relentless indifference of the wilderness. They had lost hope, found it again, and emerged stronger, more resilient and more deeply bound together. The Yukon winter had been an unforgiving wight, a crucible that had forged them anew, but they had survived, and as the first faint whispers of spring drifted through the air, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new life, the Baker family knew that they had not just endured, they had triumphed. Their cabin, their small haven in the vast wilderness, stood as a testament to their unwavering spirit, a beacon of human resilience against the wild, untamed heart of the North. The lessons learned in the unforgiving wight would stay with them, etched into their very souls, a legacy of survival and an enduring hope for the seasons to come.